The author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, identified the horrors of slavery in her novel. She chronicled the life of Uncle Tom, a loyal slave who was eventually sold away from his paternalistic owner. In this emotional anti-slavery story, Uncle Tom is eventually beaten to death by his new owner. The book became an immediate bestseller nationally and internationally. In its first year alone, over 300,000 copies were sold. It was even turned into a popular play. The theater poster here identifies Uncle Tom's beating at the hands of the evil Simon Legree. You can click on the hyperlink below to more information about the book's impact. Uncle Tom's Cabin was important because it angered people in both the North and South. Northerners identified with the book's message and became more sympathetic to the anti-slavery cause. Southerners were infuriated as they argued Stowe misrepresented the treatment of slaves by slaveholders. The next crisis addressed events associated with the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. We can begin with some background. By the 1850s, many, particularly those in the North, hoped to construct a railroad linking the rest of the nation with the newly acquired territories out west. The only problem was that much of the West remained unorganized territory. As you can see with this map of the United States in 1850, vast tracts of land in the West continued to remain unorganized. Support was strong by many for a transcontinental railroad, but many politicians balked at having it run through territories unorganized by the national government. Another factor influencing events was the desire by many Southerners to see slavery expand into new Western territories. However, the Missouri Compromise, passed by Congress in the 1820s, prohibited its expansion into many parts of the West. Here we see that Missouri Compromise line. Congress had etched in stone over 3 decades before that slavery could never expand in the Louisiana Purchase territory north of the latitude line 36 degrees, 30 minutes. This is when Senator Stephen Douglas stepped in. A railroad to the west would undoubtedly benefit his home state of Illinois, and if he crafted a compromise pleasing to both Northerners and Southerners, he might be able to win the presidency in a future election. So, in 1854, Douglas proposed and Congress passed what came to be known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. First, it created 2 new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. This map identifies the boundaries of the newly created Kansas and Nebraska territories, which had originally become American soil with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. The final 2 provisions of the Act were quite controversial. The Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise. Finally, it determined the legal status of slavery in Kansas and Nebraska would be determined by popular sovereignty. By acting as a champion for westward expansion and democracy in the form of popular sovereignty, Douglas hoped to gain popularity. Instead, Douglas underestimated opposition to slavery's expansion. The significance of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was twofold. First, it infuriated opponents of slavery. The Missouri Compromise had declared that slavery would never expand into this area. Now its expansion was possibly right around the corner. Secondly, it led to the end of the Second American Party system. Ever since the late 1820s, the nation was dominated by 2 political parties. Initially, the focus of each dealt with reactions to Andrew Jackson's policies, but they did evolve over time. Jackson's supporters were Democrats, and his opponents were Whigs. Each party had some level of support in each region of the nation. Not a single Northern Whig in the House of Representatives voted in favor of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Within a short period of time, the Whig Party ceased to exist altogether. The Kansas-Nebraska Act also led to Bleeding Kansas. Both supporters and opponents of slavery flocked to Kansas. An initial election held in 1855 was tainted by fraud, as many pro-slavery advocates from Missouri voted illegally and elected their candidates to the legislature. Eventually, there was bloodshed between supporters of slavery and free soilers in Kansas. This map identifies several areas where attacks were undertaken by both sides. The arrow points to the location of an attack near Pottawatomie Creek. Pottawatomie Creek was the location of a brutal massacre. There, abolitionist John Brown, along with some other men, abducted a group of pro-slavery advocates and murdered them. One was shot to death, and the others were hacked to pieces. The image here shows a group of anti-slavery men armed and ready to fight. This political cartoon shows how tension found its way to the United States Senate of all places. During debate concerning events in Kansas, Senator Charles Sumner delivered a speech highly critical of slaveholders and a specific defender of slavery in the Senate. Shortly thereafter, a relative of the insulted senator, who was also a member of the United States House of Representatives named Preston Brooks, physically beat Sumner with his cane on the floor of the U.S. Senate. As if those events weren't enough to show the nation was facing a crisis, a decision handed down by the Supreme Court only added flames to the fire of debate over slavery. We can start with some background to the Dred Scott decision. This case involved a slave named Dred Scott, who originally lived in the slave state of Missouri, but was then taken by his owner to the state of Illinois and Wisconsin Territory, regions where slavery was illegal. Scott sued his owner for his freedom. Scott's legal case was based on his residence in the free state of Illinois, which had prohibited slavery, and Wisconsin Territory, which originally had been organized as part of Michigan, as shown here. Congress had prohibited slavery in the Wisconsin Territory in the Missouri Compromise. Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote the decision handed down by the majority in 1857. First, he argued, Scott was not granted his freedom. Residence in areas where slavery was illegal did not mean slaves could be freed. Secondly, he declared that blacks, whether slave or free, were not citizens of the United States and therefore did not have any citizenship rights. He then continued by declaring Congress had no authority to ban slavery anywhere because slaves were the property of their owners and private property was protected by the Constitution. Only states had the right to ban slavery. Taney's broad ruling was supposed to settle the debate over slavery, but it only made things worse. This decision infuriated many in the North, while Southerners saw it as validation for what they had been saying about the legal status of slavery for decades. Either way, it was important to opponents of slavery because they feared the actions of the courts might allow slavery to expand to additional areas, and it reinforced the notion that slavery was not just a regional problem, but a national one as well. For more information about this subject, you may click on the hyperlinks below.